A Night with the Departed. This story revolves around a young man named Mark, a guy in his 20s who does not have much formal education and no specific skills to boast of. Because of this, Mark often worked odd jobs to make ends meet. His relatives and friends were concerned. They saw that Mark was getting older and still hadn't found steady employment. One day, a relative suggested that Mark take a job at a funeral home in Singapore on Sin Min Road, known for being stable and having higher pay than the temporary jobs he was used to. Mark had some family responsibilities, like taking care of his parents, so the idea of a higher-paying job appealed to him. Despite being slightly hesitant, he agreed and took the job. The next few stories revolve around the strange events that Mark experienced while working at this funeral home. On Mark's first day at work, his relative introduced him to Mr. Roy, the supervisor at the funeral home. Mr. Roy briefed Mark on his duties and the rules he needed to follow, including some superstitions and taboos. After going over the essentials, Mr. Roy paused and warned Mark, "This job isn't suitable for everyone. It's not just about being brave. You need a certain resilience. If you get sick often or start seeing things, it's a sign that you might not be cut out for this work. If you keep pushing, it could cost you your life." Mark found the warning odd and a bit unsettling, but he brushed it off. As a young guy, he was confident in his courage and thought he'd be fine. He agreed to take on the job. The funeral home where Mark worked wasn't like the large, grand places you might see in a big city. It was a smaller, more modest establishment. Because of this, Mark had to handle multiple tasks, from driving the hearse to setting up for services and even taking the night shift to guard the premises. Months passed, and Mark considered himself lucky. He never felt sick, nor had he seen anything strange. He thought he must be well suited for the job. One night, it was Mark's turn to work the overnight shift. Just before he was about to finish for the day, a body was brought in. A man from Malaysia who had died of a heart attack while working in Singapore. The funeral home was instructed to hold the body overnight until it could be transferred to Johor Bahru in Malaysia the next day. Mr. Roy gave Mark clear instructions. "Whatever you do, don't open the mortuary's freezer door tonight, no matter what you hear." Mark, thinking Mr. Roy was just trying to scare him, laughed it off, saying, "I've been here long enough. I'm not afraid of anything." Mr. Roy explained, "It's not about scaring you. If you open that door, the warm air will mix with the cold, and the body might start decomposing faster. It's not something you want to mess with." Understanding the practical reason behind the warning, Mark promised not to open the door and began his shift. The night was quiet, and Mark kept himself busy with routine checks around the funeral home. As the hours passed, he settled at his desk, ready to pass the rest of the night uneventfully. Around 11 p.m., 4 middle-aged men showed up at the funeral home. Mark approached them and asked why they were there so late. One of them explained that they were colleagues of the deceased man and wanted to see him one last time. Remembering Mr. Roy's warning, Mark politely told them that it wasn't possible to see the body that night, but that they could come back at 7 a.m., just before the body would be transferred. The men seemed disappointed but understanding. They agreed to return the next morning and left. However, around midnight, one of the men returned alone. Mark, surprised to see him, asked why he had come back. The man, looking lost and confused, said he had nowhere else to go. and asked if he could stay in the lobby until morning. Mark, feeling a bit sorry for the man, agreed and offered him a seat. The man sat quietly, his head down, as if in deep thought, or perhaps even dozing off. A few hours later, around 2 a.m., Mark started feeling hungry. He made himself some coffee and grabbed a snack, then decided to be kind and offered the man a cup of coffee as well. The man declined, saying, "Thanks, but I just need to see him one last time to believe he's really gone." Mark comforted him, saying they'd get through the night and he'd be able to say his goodbyes in the morning. The rest of the night, he was passed quietly. As dawn approached, Mark noticed the man hadn't touched the food or coffee he'd left for him. When he went to check on him, the man was gone, though Mark thought he might have stepped out for breakfast. At 7 a.m. sharp, the other 3 men returned to the funeral home. As they began the final preparations to transfer the body, Mark was busy helping out. When he went to look at the body, his heart skipped a beat. The man lying there was the same man who had sat with him all night, the one who said he had nowhere else to go. Mark glanced back at the lobby where the man had been sitting, but the man wasn't there. Instead, in the final moments before the body was taken away, Mark saw the man's spirit standing there, nodding at him, his form slowly fading until he disappeared entirely. Mark stood frozen, goosebumps covering his skin. He realized then that the man's spirit had lingered, not yet ready to depart until he could see his own body one last time. As the transfer was completed, Mark couldn't shake the eerie feeling that the man had been with him throughout the night, in both body and spirit. The mortuary night shift. For about 2 years, Sam had been working at a funeral home. Though the job was unsettling at first, over time, he grew used to the dark, quiet nights and the constant presence of the dead. The pay was decent, but it came with a price. His friends and even his girlfriend distanced themselves, uncomfortable with his line of work. In the end, all Sam had left was the job, and he couldn't quit because he had his elderly parents to take care of. One night, just past midnight, Sam was on his usual shift, watching over the mortuary. From the doorway, he noticed a couple arguing fiercely at the intersection just outside. The man was big, covered in tattoos, and looked dangerous, while the woman seemed desperate, pulling away from him as he grabbed her. At first, Sam just watched, curiosity piqued, but when the man raised his hand to strike her, Sam felt he had to intervene. "Hey, leave her alone," Sam shouted as he stepped forward. But as he approached, he realized just how imposing the man was. Covered in tattoos, with a menacing look, the man turned to Sam, his eyes burning with anger. Sam's heart raced. He knew he was no match for this guy, but he'd already spoken up. The man started toward him, swearing and threatening, clearly not afraid of Sam, or even the idea of police. Panicked, Sam pulled out his phone, trying to bluff. "I'll call the cops if you touch her again." But the man laughed it off, getting even closer. Just as Sam thought he was about to get hit, the man suddenly stopped, his eyes darting over Sam's shoulder. For a moment, he looked terrified. Without another word, he grabbed the woman and stormed off, disappearing into the dark streets. Confused, Sam turned around, but there was nothing behind him. Shaking off the strange encounter, he went back inside, relieved to be safe. About 20 minutes later, 2 men in black suits walked into the mortuary. They had an eerie presence, their eyes cold and focused. "Did you see a big guy with tattoos around here earlier?" one of them asked, his voice low and gravelly. Sam, assuming they were cops, nodded. Yeah, he was causing trouble with a woman out front, but he left. The men exchanged glances, and one of them gave Sam a curt nod. Thanks, he muttered, before they turned and left as abruptly as they had arrived. Later that night, the woman from the street rushed into the mortuary, clearly shaken. She begged Sam to hide her, saying the man chasing her was part of a dangerous gang, and she was scared he would find her. Sam reassured her, telling her the police, those two men, had already taken care of him. But the woman insisted she needed to hide. She darted into the restroom before Sam could stop her. Not long after, the two men in black returned, dragging the tattooed man with them. He was subdued and silent, a far cry from the menacing figure he had been earlier. They nodded at Sam again, almost as if to thank him, before leading the man away. Feeling relieved, Sam knocked on the restroom door to tell the woman it was safe, but there was no answer. After several attempts, he pushed the door open, only to find the restroom empty. The woman had vanished. The next day, Sam told his boss, Mr. Lee, about the strange events. Mr. Lee listened quietly, then reminded Sam to stay out of trouble, especially when dealing with dangerous people. He mentioned that a notorious gang leader's body was being delivered to the mortuary later that day, and that Sam should handle everything with care. That afternoon, a group of rough-looking men escorted the body to the mortuary. They were covered in tattoos, much like the man from the night before. As Sam helped place the body in the cold storage, he couldn't shake the feeling of dread washing over him. When he caught a glimpse of the corpse's face, his blood ran cold. It was the same man who had threatened him the night before. The gang members watched as the monks performed the funeral rites. The atmosphere was tense, the air heavy with unspoken threats. One of the gang members bragged to Sam about how their leader had fought off 3 cops before being hit by a car, eventually succumbing to his injuries. Sam nodded along, pretending to be impressed, but inside he knew the truth. The man had been dead long before he ever laid eyes on him that night. And those 2 cops, they were something else entirely. As the funeral went on, Sam kept glancing around, half expecting to see those men in black again, or perhaps the woman who had disappeared. But all he could do was keep his head down and hope whatever had happened that night wouldn't come back to haunt him, at least not while he was on duty. Ouija board. About 5 or 6 years ago, during the Hungry Ghost Festival, a group of 4 friends decided to gather on the rooftop of one of their homes for a late-night barbecue. Among them was Albert, who was joined by his friends Ben, Sarah, and Jung. As they were grilling, someone in the group suggested, "Why don't we play the Ouija board?" It turned out that one of them had already planned this in advance, bringing along a homemade Ouija board and all the necessary materials. Curious and intrigued, the group agreed to give it a try. None of them had ever played before, so they were a mix of scared and skeptical as they set up the board on a small table. Each of them placed their fingertips on the planchette, and they began to call upon any spirits that might be present. To their surprise, the planchette started moving. At first, they all looked at each other, wondering if someone was pushing it, but everyone denied doing so. Zhang, the boldest of the group, decided to ask the first question. "Are you a man or a woman?" The planchette moved to man. He continued, "Are there many spirits around us right now?" The planchette pointed to yes, and then spelled out the number 13. They were shocked, but continued asking questions, with each spirit leaving after being called upon. However, When they tried to communicate with the third spirit, the planchette moved on its own, spelling out a cryptic message: road, single, poem, and lust. Confused, the group couldn't make sense of these words. Suddenly, Albert made a connection. "Sarah," he said, "isn't that like your name?" Sarah, who was dating Zhang, suddenly looked pale. She remembered that about 6 months ago, she had been pregnant, but they had decided not to keep the baby. Feeling uneasy, Sarah asked the spirit, "Are you our child?" The planchette moved to yes. Overcome with emotion, Sarah's eyes welled up with tears, and Zhang apologized profusely, tears in his own eyes. But the planchette continued to move, spelling out anger, indicating that the spirit was furious. The atmosphere grew tense as the planchette spelled out, "Don't cry, I must go." They tried to close the session by moving the planchette to goodbye, but it refused to return to the center. Instead, it started spinning rapidly, as if caught between two opposing forces. The planchette was shaking violently, and the friends could feel the pressure mounting. Ben, trying to keep everyone calm, reminded them not to let go of the planchette, as that could lead to something worse. They all held on, terrified as the planchette spun and spun. Then it spelled out another message: not allowed to leave. Realizing the spirit was hostile, Ben suggested they all start chanting prayers together. As they did, the planchette spelled out, "Mom, I will save you," and continued to battle with the unseen force. It seemed as though their lost child was trying to protect Sarah from another, more malevolent spirit. After what felt like an eternity of chanting and pleading, the planchette slowly moved back to the center, spelling out, "Mom is safe. I must go." Finally, it stopped moving altogether. The friends were left shaken, but relieved that the terrifying encounter was over. They packed up the Ouija board and, with a deep sigh of relief, decided never to speak of that night again. Stealing ancestral relics. This story happened in Malaysia during the 1980s. The main character was a long-haul truck driver named Fei Bo, who often drove across Malaysia, taking days or even weeks to complete his trips. Despite being married with a family, Fei Bo was quite a wild character, enjoying gambling, drinking, and other vices. To save the accommodation money provided by his company, he often slept in his truck, using the money for his indulgences instead. One day, Fei Bo took a job to deliver goods from Johor to Penang. He arrived at the customer's house in Johor to load the cargo, and while checking the items, he noticed a locked wooden box about the size of an A4 sheet and a few inches thick. It looked expensive, made of lacquered wood. When he asked the customer about it, they said they didn't have the key and didn't know what was inside. They just told him to write box on the list. Fei Bo did as instructed, loaded everything onto his truck, and set off. After a few hours of driving, Fei Bo stopped for lunch. While eating, he couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious wooden box. He decided to check it out, so he took the box to the driver's seat and, using skills he learned as a kid, picked the lock. Inside, he found cash and some jewelry, a pair of gold earrings, a gold ring, and a beaded necklace. Realizing there was no mention of the box's contents on the delivery list, Fei Bo decided to keep the valuables, thinking no one would know. He locked the empty box back up and continued his journey. By the evening, Fei Bo reached Kuala Lumpur, and, eager to spend his newfound wealth, treated himself to a massage, sauna, a lavish dinner, and even spent the night with a hostess. The next morning, he woke up alone in the hotel room, packed up quickly, and continued his journey. Around lunchtime, Fabo stopped to eat at a roadside stall. When he returned to his truck, he found a young, attractive woman standing nearby, dragging a suitcase. She asked if he was heading to Penang and if she could hitch a ride, offering to pay him. Fabo, attracted to her, agreed immediately. As they drove, Fabo made advances toward the woman, who didn't resist. He thought he might get lucky. By nightfall, Fabo parked the truck at a secluded spot and suggested they spend the night there. He bought food and beer, and they ate and drank in the truck. Fabo then presented her with the gold earrings and ring he had stolen, and she seemed pleased. They ended up spending a passionate night together. The next morning, Fabo woke up feeling the hot sun on his skin, only to find himself lying in a cemetery, wearing nothing but his underwear. The woman was nowhere to be seen, and his truck was parked at a distance. Panicked, he ran to the truck and drove away, scared out of his wits. Later, he reached the destination in Penang, where he met an elderly couple, the recipients of the cargo. He helped them unload the goods and then stayed for a drink. During the conversation, the couple revealed that the items belonged to their daughter, who had died a few years ago. Fabo felt a chill as he saw a family photo on the table, recognizing the woman from the previous night. The couple confirmed it was their late daughter. Terrified, Fabo made a quick excuse and left. Feeling the need to set things right, Fabo contacted his uncle, who was experienced with supernatural matters. His uncle advised him to apologize and offer a proper ritual to the spirit. Fabo returned to the elderly couple and explained part of what happened, omitting his theft. The couple, believing their daughter's spirit had just hitched a ride, took Fabo to her grave, where he sincerely apologized and made offerings. After that, Fabo returned to his normal life, keeping the eerie encounter a secret from his wife. Surprisingly, nothing bad happened to him afterward. Instead, his luck seemed to improve, making him believe that his sincere apology had appeased the spirit. The Neighbor Girl. This tale unfolds in Singapore's Marietta Tower, roughly 30 years ago. 3 HVAC technicians, Quan, Wei, and Sam, shared an apartment in Singapore. Next door lived a stunningly beautiful girl who often smoked alone on her balcony. Initially, they tried to engage her in conversation, but she mostly ignored them, leaving them feeling snubbed. Eventually, they gave up. During Lunar New Year, the 3 friends, all originally from Malaysia, returned home for the holidays. When they returned to Singapore a few weeks later, they noticed the girl was no longer around. Curious, they asked their landlord about her. He explained that she had paid 6 months' rent in advance before heading back to Malaysia, suggesting she might stay there for a while. Time passed, and as the Qingming festival approached in March, Quan and his friends went back to Malaysia for ancestral rites. While there, Quan read a newspaper article about a young woman who had committed suicide in Kuala Lumpur. Shocked, he realized it was their beautiful neighbor. She had taken her life due to a failed relationship with a married man. Quan brought the newspaper back to Singapore and showed it to Wei, Sam, and their landlord. Everyone was stunned. The landlord mentioned he couldn't terminate her lease prematurely and would try to contact her family to retrieve her belongings. From then on, Sam became increasingly distraught and disoriented. Concerned, Quan eventually coaxed the truth out of him. Sam had been a compulsive gambler, deeply in debt. One night, he snuck into the girl's apartment via the balcony and stole a watch to sell for gambling money. When he learned of her death, guilt consumed him. Quan and Wei scolded Sam, insisting he return the watch or a replacement to her apartment. However, Sam confessed he had already sold it. They decided to contact the girl's spirit to seek her forgiveness. The trio used an Ouija board in her apartment to communicate with her spirit. The spirit agreed to forgive Sam on 2 conditions: return a photograph and love letters to her family, and give the money from the watch sale to her mother. They fulfilled these tasks, hoping to put the ordeal behind them. However, Sam's nightmares persisted. He dreamt of the girl's vengeful spirit calling his name. Even when awake, he felt her presence. One night, Quan and Wei, along with a friend knowledgeable in spiritual matters, performed a ritual to confront the spirit. The Ouija board session was chaotic, with the planchette moving violently. Their friend intervened with a powerful talisman, seemingly banishing the spirit. Sam's nightmares ceased, and he felt relief. Months later, while traveling back to Malaysia, Sam and Wei were involved in a car accident. Sam died on the spot, and Wei was seriously injured. Quan rushed to Malaysia to learn what happened. Wei recounted the eerie details. Sam had inexplicably unbuckled his seatbelt before the crash, and just before the accident, a ghostly figure of a girl had appeared in the road, causing Wei to swerve and lose control. The spirit they had thought was banished had taken its final revenge on Sam, leaving a lingering chill in the air around Quan and Wei as they grappled with the consequences of their actions. Thank you all for watching this video. Feel free to share your thoughts and experiences in the comments section. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to my channel. Also, make sure to ring the notification bell for future updates.